everybody. Good morning. This is when you say good morning back. Good morning, everyone. There you go. Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Riedman. I'm president of the Charles River Regional Chamber, and we're so happy to have you with us today for this really important conversation. We called this our fall. This is our annual Fall Real Estate Forum, our housing crisis. But I think it's also really about our housing opportunity, and we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about why this is important, and also why and what we can do about it, in very specific terms, some things we can do about it as well. So we have a really good program. We're so delighted to have Lee Pelton here from the Boston Foundation with us, and then we'll learn a little bit about the MBTA Communities Act and how that applies to our 4 chamber communities and why that matters, and then have a discussion about all what that means with you all in the last hour of the program. So thank you for that. My thanks to Boston Development Group, Boylston Properties, Essence Susel Real Estate, Fairlane Properties, Rockland Trust, LGA CPAs, and the Village Bank for making this possible today, and please give them a round of applause. And my thanks to Jeff Knoyer and his team here at UMass on the Mount Ida campus. Such an important asset for us, and many people said they haven't been here today. Even in this gloomy sort of day, this place looks beautiful. The campus looks beautiful. Jeff, thank you so much for hosting us. So without further ado, I'd like to invite John Rufo, who is the chair of the board of the chamber, to say hello to you all and introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everybody. That's excellent, excellent. Reminds me of church. It's my pleasure to introduce Lee Pelton this morning, but before I do that, I thought I wanted to say 2 words about today's program and 2 words about maybe current times in general. Those 2 words are passion and community. When it comes to passion, I'm thinking about passionate listening. It's been interesting to watch the unfolding of the conversation around rezoning in Newton, and it's been interesting to see it begin to take shape in Needham, which is a town that I live in. Those things are circulating obviously around the MBTA Communities Act, which is an incredible opportunity to really make a dent in housing and create some new opportunities for all the members of our community. And one of the things that has been said over and over again and was quoted, I think, in the Needham Observer, and I'm very glad the Needham Observer exists. It's a great thing. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think it was our state senator, Becca Rausch, that was quoted as saying that the desire for perfect should never, I believe it was, should never be the enemy of the good. And I think that's something that we can all get behind. We all have different opinions. There's going to be really different ideas about how our community should be shaped and what they look like. I think it's important to listen, and I would say listen passionately. Second thing I would say is that the old adage about location, location, location in real estate, I'd like you to think today about community, community, community instead. I think a location is a spot on a map, but a community is what makes the location so valuable and so desirable, or just a great place to be. Our communities are more than really just a spot on the map. They are the confluence of people and businesses and our political leaders and our schools, our streets, our parks. All of those things come together. So if I can lodge the word community in the back of your mind as we talk about real estate, as we talk about housing, and especially as we hear about the MBTA Communities Act, I think that would be a great thing. Okay, so that's my 2-point spiel. And now I'm happy to introduce Lee. So early this year, Boston Magazine named Lee Pelton the 3rd most influential Bostonian. Maura Healey and Ayanna Pressley were number 1 and number 2, so everyone in that group is in good company. The grandson of sharecroppers, Lee grew up in Wichita, Kansas. He lived in a house that had no plumbing until he was 6 years old, and he was the first person in his family to attend college. He came to the Boston Foundation in 2021 after a decade as the president of Emerson College, and he held various positions in higher ed prior to that. Under his leadership at the Boston Foundation, Under his leadership, the Boston Foundation has led efforts to focus both the Foundation's work and, thank goodness, all of our attention on several of the most pressing challenges of our time, including climate, racial and ethnic equity, reproductive health, and the topic that we've asked Lee to focus on today, which is housing. So please join me in welcoming Lee Pelton.
Well, thank you. It's a real joy to be here, and I'm very pleased that you've taken up this very complex topic around housing. It's during the change of the seasons, my allergies set in, and so by the end of my talk, I want you to be patient, and I hope you will think of what Mark Twain said of Richard Wagner's music. It's better than it sounds. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you. I want to begin by thanking Greg and the Charles River Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to join you during your annual real estate forum, and for dedicating, as I said earlier, today's forum to such an important topic, which of course focuses on housing and the ever-increasing crisis and its impacts on communities, especially its impact on moderate and low-income families and individuals. You know, explore just about any American metropolitan area and you will find a city divided. One prosperous and well off, and the other still struggling to make ends meet. And in a recent Menino survey of mayors, 2/3 of the respondents indicated that they were worried about the racial wealth gap in their city, and the bigger the city, the bigger the concern. Boston, John Winthrop's shining city on a hill, is a vivid example. In East Boston, glittering new waterfront condos sit a stone's throw from older working-class housing. Neighborhoods in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan see affordable rentals transformed into pricey condos. A shrinking Chinatown feels the pressure of development on all sides, and census and real estate data tell the story. Median home values rose faster in Somerville, Cambridge, Brookline, and Boston than anywhere else in the state. And for those able to buy into the market, the growth has been exhilarating. But for those on the outside looking in, it means higher rents and more significant housing costs. The shrinking affordable housing market, in part a byproduct of various zoning and land use policies, intensifies the distress and the lack of opportunity for many greater Bostonian residents who want to be homeowners. By the way, I choose not to use zoning as a nomenclature, but rather land use, of which zoning is a subset of that. And land use, from the beginning of this country, has always been about wealth and privilege. And I want you to think about that as I move through this conversation. While the rising cost of living and the unequal distribution of our region's economic growth is a challenge for all families, the persistent legacy of structural racism and the stubborn continuance of interpersonal bias mean that these challenges fall with extra weight on our region's families of color, particularly Black and Latinx families. And as you know, accumulating wealth provides families and individuals with the assets to buy a house, to pay for college without excessive borrowing, to save for retirement, to pass along wealth to descendants, and weather rough financial patches and severe downturns in the economy. In other words, it offers financial security and well-being. And in an essential sense, it creates equity. It closes the economic and social opportunity gaps between those who have enjoyed its benefits and those who have not. And the value of a home is more than the joy one has living in it. It's the means of creating wealth that in turn leads to a more abundant and joyful life. But of course, you know all of that. Most important, erasing the racial wealth gap will benefit all of us. By one estimate, eliminating the racial wealth gap has cost the American economy over $15 trillion in the last 20 years. And closer to home, the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation estimated that closing the racial wealth gap in Massachusetts could create about $25 billion of GDP over the next 5 years. So closing this racial wealth gap means more money in the system for everyone. It is not a zero-sum kind of circumstance. And for everyone, regardless of race or ethnicity, it's an essential element of a broader strategy to evolve our knowledge and understanding of inequitable structures, and then imagine, develop, and implement the best policies and programmatic solutions to do away with them. Since the 1960s, the Boston Foundation has been deeply committed to supporting community efforts to address the desperate and ongoing need for affordable housing and to increase housing stability. Our commitment to that important work will continue with renewed vigor and renewed focus. We will also shine a bright light on municipal and state land use policies, approaches that have been mostly well-intentioned, I believe, but nonetheless have made it difficult, if not nearly impossible, to increase the much-needed supply of affordable housing to buy or to rent. In parallel to these efforts, we have launched a new signature Greater Boston multi-sector partnership to close the racial wealth gap by boosting home ownership among residents of color and those living in underserved communities. Because, as we all know, if this doesn't apply to Jeff Bezos, but it applies to most of us, that home ownership is the largest component of wealth for the average households. Our region's housing crisis has made it difficult for families and individuals to rent an apartment or own a home. So you will hear me address that today, the housing crisis and its direct ties to our state's racial wealth gap. As leaders in Newton and Needham and Watertown and Wellesley, you have an opportunity to influence, as you are today, and influence how your communities respond to this multifaceted crisis, and that's what I hope you leave with here today, an understanding of how this crisis harms all of us and what each of us can do to improve access to affordable housing and home ownership in Massachusetts, and in doing so, making Massachusetts a better place for everyone to call home. I need not tell you that Greater Boston is facing a crippling housing shortage. You also know that we are facing an incredible affordability crisis. To purchase a median price home in metropolitan Boston, a household needs somewhere north of $180,000 in annual income. And yet the annual average salary in Boston is around $80,000. And most salaries in Boston range between $63,000, that's at the 25th percentile, to about $98,000 at the 75th percentile on an annual basis. This won't surprise you either. In August of this year, the median listing home price in Boston was $949,000, trending up 18.8% year over year. Last year, I would have said that that number was about $915,000. The median listing home price per square foot is $887. The median home sold price in Greater Boston was $716,000. And the median sale price for single-family homes statewide in May 23 was $616,000. So a lack of inventory, competition in the housing market are driving up prices, according to Allison Socha, president of the Greater Boston Association of Realtors. The few homes that are available for sale get multiple offers, she said, and this really comes down to a long-standing production issue. A year ago, a report noted that Boston is now the second most expensive city in the U.S. for renters. Boston's one-bedroom median rent price is over $3,000 per month, behind only New York, which is at about $3,900 per month. Boston's housing expenses are up 124%, or 124% higher than the national average, and utility prices are 25% higher than the national average. Transportation expenses like bus fares and gas prices are 28% higher than the national average. So home ownership is far out of the reach, and renting at today's prices is also unaffordable. Even for those who might qualify for a Section 8 voucher, they will more than likely find themselves on a waiting list that could last up to 5 years. Where might this leave them when the demand for the limited number of subsidized units is so significant? For example, the Allston-Brighton Community Development Corporation has 500 units, half of which have rental subsidies, and they have a waiting list of 170,000 people. Here in Massachusetts, Black and Latinx households are a little more than half as likely as white households to own homes. And if they try to buy in this market, they're moving out to places like Brockton, Randolph, Avon, Stoughton to the south, Lowell, Lynn, and Lawrence to the north, but not to Wellesley, not to Needham, not to Watertown, and not to Newton. In fact, Greater Boston ranks 24th for racial segregation among all large metropolitan areas, falling into what was called the high segregation category. Zooming out to the state level, more than 60% of the Massachusetts Black population resides in just 10 cities, with 52% in Boston, Brockton, Springfield, and Randolph. And just 10 cities are home to over half of the state's Latinx population. Segregation, I think that you will agree, at least I hope you will agree, is widely understood to be bad for our health outcomes, our social and cultural outcomes, our learning outcomes, and life expectancy outcomes. In fact, one's zip code is a better indicator of one's, or predictor of one's life expectancy than one's genetic makeup. It's estimated that at least 60% or more of our health is determined solely by our zip codes. We have a stark example of that in Boston, where the life expectancy of those living in Back Bay is 92 years, and those living in Roxbury, about 2 miles away, or to put it another way, about 10,000 steps away, is 69 years, a 32-year gap. So David Williams, who is a professor of public health at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, conducted a study which found that if you could eliminate statistically racial segregation, you would completely erase black-white differences in income, in education, and in unemployment. There's not a single municipality in Greater Boston that has even moderately high incomes compared with the moderately large Black and Latinx population share. In Lawrence, for example, where Black and Latinx make up 83% of the population, the median household income is around $45,000. In Dover, Massachusetts, the highest income town in the Commonwealth, the Latinx and Black population is just around 4%. So I believe that, and I hope you do too, that housing is a universal human need. And yet, as a region and as a society, we continue to fall short of fulfilling that need for all. And Boston's TBF's 2022 housing report card, we noted that the persistent realities of the region's housing crisis related to market forces. Cities and towns with variable insufficient housing production histories and rents and home prices, they're among, as I just noted, the highest in the country. There are, however, some bright spots. Metro core communities, these are high-density inner cities, urban with a mix of apartment buildings, multi-family houses, single-family houses, and regional urban centers. These are high-density urban centers proximate outside of Boston, a mix of housing types. They have urban-scale downtown core surrounded by more suburban residential neighborhoods. As defined in our report card, issued many more housing permits than previous years, paving the way to increase the housing supply. On the other hand, what we call maturing suburbs, and maybe this will sound familiar to you, higher income towns, owner-occupied single-family homes, most parcels of land are developed. New growth is principally by infill development, by teardowns, by small-scale greenfield development. The population is stable or growing moderately. They have lower racial and income diversity. These maturing suburbs, which is represented here today, or all community types had an increase. Other than this, all community types had an increase in multi-family housing. And our 2019 Greater Boston Housing Report Card demonstrated that multi-family housing production increases diversity among residents, so that this trend is moving the region in the right direction, except, as I said, in these maturing suburbs. And yet, segregation persists. It is pronounced for Black and Latinx homeowners who have purchases are concentrated, as I just noted, in a few cities and towns outside in Boston. In fact, Boston and Latinx households experience disproportional harm in almost every measure related to housing. They are cost burden, as we say, at greater rates. They have lower rates of home ownership, and they're faced with eviction proceedings at higher rates. So increasing the housing supply with the underpinning of land use change is a necessary path for the region. It's a long game. It begins first with policy, then planning, and then eventually with the actual production of housing, a process that will take years and even decades. Meanwhile, shockingly, almost half of Greater Boston renters pay more than a third of their household income towards housing costs. And for many, rent extracts more than half of their income. We are in a region where sky-high rents take a toll on individuals and families. This is the crisis of the present moment, where households are at risk of losing their housing now. Renters and owners are barely making rent and mortgage payments. Those face the prospect of eviction or foreclosure, and in worst-case situations, homelessness. For those households, there's no long game. The crisis is already knocking at their doors. It is particularly, and this will come as no surprise, acute for households of color, who are much more likely to face eviction proceedings against them. It plays out in neighborhoods and communities that are home to more houses of color, particularly Black and Latinx households. By the way, I want to make a plug for a book, if you haven't read it, called Evicted, by some of you probably have. It's really an amazing book. It talks about the housing crisis and the eviction crisis in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There is no question that the best of our efforts for housing stabilization during COVID must continue with special attention to households of color, those with disabilities, recent immigrants, and others who may be reluctant or unable to seek out support from conventional sources. It's also where subsidized housing plays a vital role in providing affordable options to low-income households. As I said earlier, metro core communities have done significantly more than others in providing this affordable stock, followed by regional urban centers, but other communities are trailing far behind and must step up. No doubt many of you have read about the so-called 15-minute neighborhood. We're talking about vibrant, healthy neighborhoods where one can get to everyday destinations without too much hassle. But the importance of those neighborhoods is not in their convenience. It's in their opportunity to create more equitable communities. It's not whether one could stop at a Starbucks on the way to the dry cleaners. It's about being able to pick up a library book on your walk to the local market, or where children feel safe and welcoming public spaces encourage gathering, and where access to transit unlocks connections that don't require cars. Greater Boston has a real potential to build more 15-minute neighborhoods and network of them together in a number of ways. The 15-minute neighborhood is an opportunity for greater equity, but it's far from a guarantee. Bike lanes and better sidewalks won't erase systems of inequality or repair racial or economic segregation, but they open up possibilities. The fact is that transportation and land use policies have prioritized cars and sprawling development patterns for generations, and single-family exclusive zoning or land use has contributed to persistent residential segregation by race and by income. And urban planners have too often planned for, not with communities, planned for, but not with those communities. One example of this are the road building projects that slice through far too many long-standing neighborhoods, including in Newton some many years ago. I'm hopeful that through the multifamily zoning requirement for MBTA communities that you will hear about later, of course, we will realize the benefits of a 15-minute neighborhood with land use ordinances put in place for multifamily permits and an increase in density. So how do we begin to make a dent in this crisis? Where does our journey to end the housing crisis begin, which will also have an impact on the racial wealth gap and the health of our community? First, it begins with the recognition and an honest appraisal of how we got here, an acknowledgement of our collective responsibility to solve this crisis. We must first undertake, as I said, a hard look at the communities in which we live and how we are either helping to solve the problem or helping to exacerbate it. We cannot become a welcoming community for those who need homes if our predominant value is the preservation of the character of what exists. I would argue that you can still have beautiful communities when you add density. We must amend land use restrictions that harm the collective whole and then move to increase supply. A healthy housing market needs abundant housing options to meet the needs of all families that hope to live in our region. We need different types of housings, from single-family homes to multi-family homes, that ensure that individuals and families are able to enter the housing market at different price points, and that different household types fill the diversity needs of a diverse community. We also need to dramatically increase subsidized housing and fix the arcane system that is so burdensome and redundant that most available housing units are unfilled despite the high demand. Fairly and decently housing everyone in our region would be a huge step towards repairing past harms, from discriminatory rental practices to predatory lending, from real estate restrictions to thoughtless development. And I want to applaud Mayor Wu in Boston, who's meeting this challenge head-on with her recent executive order that focuses on expediting affordable housing approvals, preserving and financing housing, and increasing home ownership. And I would urge leaders and all of Greater Boston's municipalities to take action in their communities. There is hope. Where we see a less segregated picture is in some of the metro core communities. Cambridge and Boston, more open to locating subsidized housing in their communities, making it possible for low-income families to reside there despite deep market rate housing costs. And while supply still lags, I believe we should view this as a poly success and one for us to emulate. In 1916, John Dewey described democracy as the most ethical aspiration conceived by ethical communities. This aspiration was unattainable, he wrote, without a society's commitment to a lifelong education to develop the capacities of associated living in a society characterized by complexity and diversity. This, in my view, is the great American dream, that we can create out of the rich diversity of human experience communities made both beautiful and effective by their pluralism. Not the kind of dream that is available only to those privileged by history or family income or wealthy neighborhoods. Not the kind of dream that is built on narrow self-interest, but rather a compelling vision of what we could be if we were truly open to the best that is known and thought in the world. The kind of dream which will swing open wide the doors of opportunity, which will set the table for all to enjoy life's bounty, and which holds our nation's motto, e pluribus unum, out of the many, one, as a living creed. So thank you in advance for all that you will do to make this dream a reality for all of our citizens. Thank you very much.
We have time for maybe one or two quick questions for Lee. Anybody have anything? Don't be shy. All right, Councilor Bowman in the back.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring speech and lots of data there. Can you repeat the economic impact of not building housing? I think that was sort of the first part of your speech. I think you mentioned something about the economic impact of racial inequity in housing, how much it's holding back the economy, no?
Were you talking about the racial wealth gap? Is that what you were talking about?
Well, the racial wealth gap and the value we would get from fixing the racial wealth gap. Yes.
Yeah, I think we're talking about the same. So in the Commonwealth, fixing that would create about $25 billion of GDP over the next 5 years. And this comes from the Massachusetts, the state Massachusetts income, the Massachusetts Income Association, I think, yeah. So that's their figure, so, yeah.
And right over here.
So at the local level, what can individuals do? Like what you said, policy, planning, production, but what should we attack first? Like within the policy realm, like.
Well, James Baldwin said that not everything that is face can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's face. So what he was saying there, he's talking about truth. And I think the first step, in my experience in convenings like this and others, is to begin to understand how we got here. You know, so we have to understand how we got here. We can't take an ahistorical approach, because none of what I'm talking about happened by accident. Did not happen by accident. And so it's helpful to understand the history. And, you know, sadly in this country, let's pick a state, for instance, Florida, maybe, there is a deliberate attempt to erase history. You know, it's an erasure of history. So the first thing is for all of us in the room is to really do an honest appraisal of how we got here and to understand that. And I believe once you understand that, then the next steps will follow through the communities. But that's the first important step.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Lee, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm an Emerson alum who appreciated what you did at Emerson and maybe a little disappointed when you left there, but clearly you're in the right place and doing really important work, and we're grateful to that. So thank you very much. A couple quick housekeeping notes. First, you should know that we're going to, when Chris comes up here and shows some slides, you will all get the slides in via email if you registered, so you don't have to scribble every note of everything she's saying. Also, New TV is here, our friends at New TV, and they'll be recording this, so you'll have a chance to see that. We'll share the slides with you, as well as a link to the housing report card that Lee referred to in an email to you today, and we'll get you the video in a couple days, right? So we're glad to do that. Next, I want to turn to that part that I talked about, the housing opportunity, specifically the MBTA Communities Law and what it means. It was signed by Governor Baker in early 2021, but really hasn't gone into effect yet. Really, our communities are in the middle of now adapting those plans and figuring it out. Just so you know, a reminder, Newton has to have their plan done by the end of this calendar year. Needham, Wellesley, and Watertown all have to have their plan done by December 31st of next year. So we're all in the thick of it, but that's really important to know. So Chris Kluchman, who is has been the person in the middle of developing and designing this law since it was founded. She worked in the Baker administration. She's now with the Healey administration, and she really is the person that can give us some insight into what this means, and we're really delighted, Chris, to have you with us today. Chris has more than 3 decades of experience in state, regional, municipal planning, housing policy, transportation planning, and just as importantly for all of us, she spent 7 years on the municipal level doing land use and planning for the town of Westford. So she understands a lot of what we're trying to do, and that's why I think she's been so valuable and important in this role. So we're delighted to have her here. Chris, thank you so much. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so very much. It's wonderful to be here, and what a tough act to follow is what I can say. Thanks, Brian. Just to recap what Lee was saying, to think about local action and understanding past history, there's an excellent book called The Color of Law. It's a devastating book, but it by Richard Rothstein, and so if you have not read The Color of Law, that's probably your #1 book that I would suggest that you read to understand how we got here. So I'm going to just give you some data. I'm going to start with some data, and I'm going to talk about statewide data, how we compare to the country. I'm going to talk about local, each of your communities, and then I'm going to do a walkthrough of the MBTA Communities Law. It is rather abstract, so please stay with me, and the slides will help you, hopefully, so you can study them at home. But I'm going to start by grounding us. Housing is not just about the numbers. Housing is about the people that live here. It's about providing housing to them. It's about the people that aren't yet Massachusetts residents that want to move to our state. It's about the students that are here that want to stay here. It's about our kids, their kids. Where are they going to live? How are they going to succeed in our Commonwealth? Lee covered some of this in his presentation, but this is a slide that shows the last 60 years of housing production in Massachusetts, starting with 1960 through almost 2020. In the first half, or the first generation, 1960 to 1990, the state built about 900,000 housing units. Between 1990 and 2020, that got cut in half. Here, the yellow bars are showing single-family housing, and the blue bars multifamily housing. And you can see right in the middle is about 1990, and from there on, we've really slowed down production of housing, primarily through local downzoning. What does this mean? it means that we're some of the highest costs in the nation. Again, Lee covered this pretty well. Massachusetts loves to be number one in many things. Here we are shown on the right, which is at the top. Unfortunately, these are about the highest home values and the highest rental prices in the country. So these are all 50 states, and this is where Massachusetts is. This is a direct result of the lack of production. Speaking to the chamber, I want to make sure that you understand, in addition to the human price that Lee so articulately talked about, this has a price for our business community. We value our highly skilled workforce. It's very important for us to attract and retain talent. I have heard numerous anecdotal conversations from businesses, not only in this region but in other regions, about trying to hire somebody from Ohio, having them show up, having them accept the job, and then show up with their family to look for housing and say, I'm so sorry, I'm going back to Ohio. I cannot find comparable housing, and I'm not going to be here. The cost of living is just too high. This chart shows how the Boston region, it's not just the city of Boston, it's the whole Boston region, how it compares to our competing metro areas. Unfortunately, here we're on the low end, and the Boston region is producing less than 4 units per 1,000 residents. All these other competing metros, Austin, Portland, Memphis, Charlotte, North Carolina, Phoenix, they're all building significantly more housing than we are. The chart on the right here is showing how we're losing to those regions that are building more housing and have cheaper cost of living. For every 3 people, for example, that we get that move here from Portland, Oregon, we're sending 10. So this is a problem for our economy, in addition to the human crisis that we have. I'm going to shift here and talk a little bit about the 4 communities that are in the chamber. And these charts all will be similar. Actually, they're very different from each other. But in these charts, they're showing the last 20 years of housing production. The orange is single-family development, and the dark blue is multifamily projects with more than 5 units, so larger developments. So Needham, as you can see, over the last 20 years, has been building primarily single-family housing. That matches its character. It's almost 80% single-family housing. It has built at a fairly good pace, especially in the last 10 years, and actually matches the state's production, the state as a whole, which produced about 6.8% increase between 2010 and 2020. So although it's single-family, it has been producing a fair number of units. Looking to Newton, it's a different pattern. Newton has produced less compared to its overall. It has the largest number of housing units in the region, but it has more diversity. And therefore, only less than 60% of its housing stock is single-family housing. And you can see that they've been producing multifamily housing kind of in dribs and drabs throughout the last 20 years. But they do have, relative to its total, it's only increasing at about 2% over 10 years. Watertown, again, looks quite different. Watertown is a community with less than a quarter of its housing stock as single family. I think this makes sense to us intuitively who know Watertown, and especially, again, I'm going to say in about the last 7 years, there's been a large increase in the number of larger multifamily projects. So go Watertown, you're doing a great job. But it's primarily just a multifamily, which is kind of interesting. And finally, talking about Wellesley, it is the smallest of the communities in terms of total housing units. It is also, like Needham, mostly single family. Its production between 2010 and 2020 was very low, about 1%, less than 100 units, according to the U.S. Census Building Permit Survey. However, in the last 3 years, there's been actually quite a different scenario in Wellesley. In 2020, there was about 400 units built, including probably 1 or 2 larger multifamily projects. And in 2021 and 2022, about 100 units each year. So the last 3 years, Wellesley's really seen a big impact. And so I understand from people in Wellesley, they may feel like they're building lots of housing, but really looking back over the last 20 years, they're just kind of getting to the production. I want to just talk for a minute, and I want to talk about resources and tools that local officials can use. I've noted here the MHP Data Town. That's a wonderful site, and MHP is Massachusetts Housing Partnership. This tool allowed me to look these up because we had a call last week with the other panelists, and somebody said, you should do some local data. So I went to Data Town, I looked up these communities, I clipped this, I could download it as a picture and plop it into this slide deck. So you too have access to that. The school enrollment references in these slides are from the public school enrollment data that's part of Data Town. So do check out Data Town, it's a wonderful resource. Okay. So now that you've heard some data, again, continue to ground yourself in thinking about residents or residents that are not yet here. We're going to talk about the MBTA Communities Act. I'm also going to refer to it as Section 3A because it's Section 3A of the law, and it's a little shorter to say. Here I'm highlighting the website, mass.gov/MBTA Communities. It's a very dense and rich website with lots of resources. I encourage you to bookmark it. We will continue to update stuff there. We have information sheets that are meant for the general public that can be downloaded. Of course, all of the rules and regulations are there, but please do go back and check that out if you have not already. Why did Governor Baker promote the MBTA communities? Why did he sign it? Why did the legislature pass it? Because, as Lee again has articulated, and you've seen from the data that I've shown you, we have a problem in building multifamily housing across the Commonwealth, and in particular in the eastern part of the state. If it's allowed at all, it's often multifamily housing permitting is subject to long, complex, and mostly oppositional hearings, public hearings, and discretionary processes at the local level. Amy Dane, who is a Newton resident, and if you don't know her work, I encourage you to read it as well, did a study about multifamily housing permitting in 100 communities in the greater Boston region, and in this 2-year period found that only 14% of all multifamily housing was permitted with as-of-right process. The discretionary process, which is special permits or variances or having to go through a legislative process to amend zoning at town meeting, can be very costly and timely for people who are looking to build multifamily housing. The MBTA Communities Act, or Section 3A, creates a new paradigm. It says all 177 communities around the Boston area have to have multifamily zoning that permits housing, that multifamily housing as of right. It wants us to create walkable neighborhoods, those vital and attractive neighborhoods near transit, if transit is featured in the communities. I'll say half of the MBTA communities that we have don't actually have fixed transit, but they're adjacent to communities that have fixed transit. I have a 10-minute ride to a commuter rail station, even though my town doesn't have commuter rail. So that is the vision that I think the legislature and the governor has, and the current governor and the current administration, the Healey district administration, also has. Let's get more production. Let's get more zoning in place. I'm going to kind of skip through the slide. Greg covered it a little bit. We started in 2021. I worked for 4 years before that to try and convince the legislature and convince communities to support this law. There was an important other part of the law which allowed for a simple majority at legislative bodies for housing-related zoning amendments. So that is making it easier for these to pass at city councils and or town meeting. We published draft guidelines in August last year, and we just last month made a revision, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. All right, so what is an MBTA community? It really is defined in the law as the MBTA's service district. Sometimes the press gets this a little bit wrong. It's not just communities that have transit, it is defined by the service district. So when we started, there were 175 communities. Fall River and New Bedford have actually since become MBTA in the service district because they're getting the South Coast commuter rail, and they're getting new stations. When you have 177 of anything, you have to kind of divide it up. And you can imagine, just looking at this map, thinking about the variety of communities that we have. So we divided it into 4 cohorts, and based around the type of transit: rapid transit, commuter rail, adjacent, and adjacent small towns. And those are shown on this map with the rapid transit in the blue, the commuter rail in the dark green, and the adjacent and the small towns in the yellow. These are really important because they, in the rules that we've developed, they really they frame how we're going to treat these communities. And so they're cohorts. Newton's a rapid transit community, Needham and Wellesley commuter rail, and Watertown is an adjacent community. This is just the basic requirements. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail, but just to kind of frame us. The statute, which is only 3 paragraphs long, says that every one of these 177 communities must have a zoning district that allows multifamily development as of right at 15 units per acre. It has to be suitable for families with children. That is, it cannot be restricted to just people 55 and older. It can't be senior housing. If transit exists, it should be located within a half mile of that transit station. The statute challenged us to define reasonable size, and I had the pleasure of working with a whole big group of very smart people and lots of lawyers. And we came up with 2 prongs to that. A minimum land area, which is kind of on its face pretty reasonable, 50 acres, which is about a tenth of a half mile circle around a transit station, and unit capacity, which is a concept of how much multifamily units can the zoning produce. The statute also said very specifically there are consequences to noncompliance, and that is you're ineligible for several important grant programs, such as MassWorks, which is the state's flagship infrastructure program. Just this last year, in the transition of my agency, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, from the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development, we have split now into 2 agencies. We've added the Housing Works Infrastructure Program. One, that's a new program, and if you're a developer in the room, you should be aware of it, because it exists in statute, and we're going to award this fall the first round of those and continue to around. I have $25 million that I get to give out for that program, and Housing Choice Grant Program. In the recent change and revision that we made last month, we've added a list of 13 grant programs that will also consider noncompliance. The Healey Driscoll administration is very serious about being very clear that noncompliance is really not an option for you. And to make that point even more, the Attorney General, Andrea Campbell, issued a statement and advisory on MBTA community compliance in March that said if you don't comply, you're breaking the law. If you're interested in that advisory opinion, it's on the MBTA Communities website. Very quickly, this just kind of frames the requirements for the different transit types. And so they're across the top of this chart. Land area is generally 50 acres, although there are some exceptions. Adjacent small towns don't have that land area requirement. The unit capacity is based on a percentage of existing housing units, with the most stringent requirements for the rapid transit communities and going down. Location is near transit, and that applies to the first 2 categories. And as Greg said, we have a variety of dates with the rapid transit communities, which are 12, of which Newton is 1, have the date of the end of this calendar year to comply. So what are we talking about in terms of multifamily housing? Are we talking about big towers, or are we talking about something else? So what we're talking about here are not the highest density that's shown on the right of this slide. This is a slide developed by Opticos Design. It's often used in the planning community to talk about this missing middle housing. This missing middle is actually historically built in many of our communities, and unfortunately has been zoned out of existence. That is, you could not build many of these things under your community's existing zoning laws, even if it exists. I'm thinking about Wellesley and Washington Street. There are a lot of these, there are buildings that look just like this. That's why we call this the missing middle, and this is the kind of housing that we're talking about. What does this look like? I think that this 15 units an acre exists in almost every one of the 177 communities. They might not think of it as their identity, especially the small adjacent towns, but this is, for example, the upper right here is Sudbury. The lower right is in a small adjacent town. It was an inn, a historic inn on a town common. It's now 4 condominiums. That's exactly 15 units an acre. So this is the kind of development that 15 units an acre will look like. I've put a web link here on the bottom of this slide. Again, if you're interested in trying to visualize density, this is one of the biggest challenges that I have, that local officials have, is getting people to understand what this looks like, and I would really suggest that you go to this website. Some of these photos are from there. They have examples of what these look like from the street, what it looks like from a drone, what it looks like on a plan view, and so it's a great resource to try and educate the public. I'm going to go pretty quickly through some of these other metrics that we think about in the guidelines that we've established. But these are examples. Folks from Needham will recognize Needham here in the top map. It's very rich in the commuter rails, and these are these half-mile circles that exist. And so Needham, Newton, and Wellesley all have the over 800 acres of a concept that we call developable station acres. That's that dark green area. So you're all at the highest requirement. That is, the more your multifamily district should be the most transit-oriented because you're very transit-rich. You have lots of transit available to you, and therefore it should be more transit-oriented. The map on the bottom is Arlington, which might be a little bit more akin to Watertown. They're both adjacent communities. That is, they don't have even 100 acres of developable station area. Watertown does kind of have a little wedge of the Waverly Station in Belmont that's within the Watertown boundary, but not enough to really put housing there, and it's not necessarily the right place to put housing anyway. And so what it really turns out to, this reasonable size, the land area, this is just a very generic commuter rail station, is that when you're doing the planning and, given the you can see the proportion of the district that has to be located in a transit area. Although 3 of your communities have the highest, many communities can do 50% near a station and more outside in other locations. But in practice, this really means that you have to find an area within a station and rezone it for multifamily housing by right. We've created this concept of unit capacity. I'm happy to maybe talk about questions about this later. We get lots of questions. It is just part of the compliance model that has to be done by the local governments to kind of proof how they develop the zoning and proof that the area that they apply it to will actually produce a certain unit capacity. So it's a technical exercise, but it doesn't really matter what's there, and that's the purpose of this slide. There could be a duplex there, but if the zoning allowed 4 units, it would be 4 units of unit capacity. If it was vacant, it would be 4 units. If there was a 4-plex on it, it would be 4 units. The compliance model goes through this exercise looking at actual parcel size. And so again, this compliance model is a technical tool. It's a very fancy spreadsheet that takes all the parcels in a district. So here's an example of a potential district. All of the parcels that are shown here would be in an Excel spreadsheet. The community has to put in the metrics for zoning. How high? What's the minimum lot area? What's the minimum frontage? So that, how many parking spaces do they require? Off-street parking spaces do they require? And all of that comes out with this number that applies to every parcel and then comes and adds it up in the end and comes up with unit capacity. What we've been seeing is communities doing this exercise and removing zoning barriers like minimum lot sizes that might be too high, or lots of frontage that's required, or a low height. When they start removing those zoning barriers and running different scenarios in this compliance model, we're finding that they're like, oh, we're having no problem with the unit capacity. This is not an issue for us. So it's very interesting to see how removing barriers can be now articulated with numbers. I want to just make sure you know that we do allow for affordable housing in the MBTA Community District. If you want to have something called inclusionary zoning, which requires development to have a certain percentage of units affordable at certain household income levels, you can do that. If you do deeper affordability, we need to look at an economic feasibility analysis to make sure you're not, for example, the community of Rowley, which is right up on the New Hampshire border. If they wanted to say, we want 50% of the units to be affordable at 50% of area median income, that would be a signal to us that they may be trying to prevent housing from being developed. So that's why we have this review of inclusionary zoning, but it is allowed. We recently changed the statute, and Greg, I want to thank the Chamber for your strong support of this, to allow communities to credit or offset some unit capacity from areas where they want to require ground floor retail. This has been a struggle for us because the law is about multifamily housing, and it defines multifamily housing as just multifamily housing. When you require commercial on the ground floor, That's not exactly multifamily housing. There's a requirement that a developer would have to do. However, we recognize it's a very important planning principle, important for some of the historic town centers that are built up around train stations, and so is important for communities to be allowed to do. I encourage you to look at the guidelines that have been posted. We even have red lines that have been posted so that you can see what has been changed. We limit it to 25% of capacity. We have to approve the location, but I think that some of the communities, in fact, I believe Newton may be one that is going to take advantage of this new provision. I'm very proud to say we have provided technical assistance in a broad way. Our goal was any community that wanted technical assistance, we would provide it. In the 12 months since we released the guidelines in 2022, we've given out $2.5 million in technical assistance. Over 120 communities are participating. They're rolling up their sleeves. I have to credit the partners here that we have, our grant programs in the Community One Stop, Massachusetts Housing Partnership, which has really been a catalyst to get communities started with the technical exercise that I've talked about, the compliance model, helping, there are other organizations such as nonprofits that are engaging with community members who want to organize around supporting housing, and also educating people about zoning. Like, what is zoning? It's a very kind of complex and abstract concept. So with all of the partners here on this slide, we've been able to deliver technical assistance to a broad range. We're going to announce even more grants in the Community One Stop for Growth announcement that'll come later this fall. Just to be clear, there are some myths out there that I want to try and myth bust, I guess. 3A, or MBTA Communities, does not require a community to produce housing. We are not going to track the production. Well, we will track the production, but you're not required to report production to us. It does not compel communities to pay for infrastructure. We encourage you to plan for infrastructure. We have a new program that will pay for infrastructure for future development, but it does not require the communities to pay for or build infrastructure to support housing. It does not supersede important environmental laws such as Title V, which are septic systems, and the Wetlands Protection Act. It does not supersede historic districts. But we do not allow for exemptions or waivers. We're pretty clear in the guidelines. You have to submit an application to us for a district compliance. We will review it, and we will thumbs up or thumbs down. We are working with communities, but there aren't variances, there aren't exemptions. Everybody must comply. And finally, I just want to conclude by saying, just to remind people, we're really looking to remove the zoning barriers that have been put up in place over time, in particular since 1990 in our local communities, that created that dip in housing production. Many cities and towns are rolling up their sleeves. I think all 4 of your communities are absolutely in the thick of it, Newton particularly really in the thick of it. And that this unit capacity concept that I've talked about is not a build-out analysis. It is not meant to be a build-out analysis. It uses lots of proxies. It is an estimate of capacity. But I think it's actually an important and interesting new planning tool, mostly for the scenario building that it allows the communities to do by testing different zoning metrics. What happens if we only require one off-street parking space? That would be interesting. And then that feeds into the compliance model. So what can you do? I'm waiting for that question. Get involved in the local level. Get involved where you have your business and your residents. If they're 2 separate places, be involved in both. You can review the action plans that communities have submitted to us. That lays out what they thought they would be doing, and so if you don't know what your community is doing, start there. What were they supposed to be doing? And then check in with your planning board or look at the agendas. What is going on? Are there planning committees that have been formed to deal with this? Again, the compliance deadlines are here, and I think very similar to what Lee told you is we can't solve our problems today if we're still using the same thinking and the same policies that got us here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. We're going to quickly set up for the panel, and we'll roll right on to our conversation. Thank you so much for that, Chris. It was really helpful. Answered a bunch of questions I think I've heard many times. So thank you for that. We're going to move now to a discussion about what we've heard And I think it's really an important part of this conversation, so appreciate those of you who can stick around for it. Our panel today, oh, that's a nice move. All right, thank you. So I would like to quickly introduce our panel to you in the order they're seated. Andrew Capoletti is a principal with Boylston Properties. He's a real estate development and construction professional who's built 65,000 units of multifamily development and construction across Greater Boston, including a project where many of us are familiar with, the Boulevard and Bond project, 302 residents at Arsenal Yards, but many others, and he is a Newton resident. He's also, if you want to keep track of what's happening in housing across the region and great articles, so follow him on LinkedIn because he links to every great, fascinating story you could hope for. Melanie Swasey is a global real estate advisor with Unlimited Sotheby's International Realty, and in that role, she works closely helping buyers and sellers find homes. And I have to tell you that this conversation today, in fact, the program today came from a conversation Melanie and I had several months ago, so I want to thank you for that, for inspiring us to do this. Finally, Daryl Settles, who is president of Catalyst Ventures Development. I actually think everybody in this room probably knows Daryl, so it's kind of silly to introduce him. But I'll remind you, he's a serial entrepreneur, civic activist, former restaurateur, real estate developer, investor, and has done so much else, including creating a fund called the Boston Real Estate Inclusion Fund to raise money. So thank you all for that. We've got 2 mics, you guys can share those. I would actually, let's just start maybe with some reaction to what Lee had to say today. And Daryl, do you want to start? Just some thoughts about what you heard from Lee before we get into more specific questions?
Yes. Hello, everyone. So I thought your talk was unbelievable. And because, you know, I used to be the chair of the Newton Economic Development Commission back in the early, 2010. And we used to have meetings at City Hall where we were talking about multifamily development and density. And there was a fight every week. People were yelling, screaming. And, I just said that, the world needs to change. And so I think that, what the governor has done with this new policy is the right thing to do, because we never would have gotten to the point that we are now. And then the fact that we had the large number of city councilors where it took 2/3 of a vote to get anything passed. So when that law changed, that's also helped us move forward. So I appreciate where we're going, and I think that the city of Newton has a long way to go, as you know. I've been living here since 2003, and I think that a model that we need to look at is what Boylston Properties has done over in Watertown in terms of the multifamilies that they've done there. They have actually created a new community. And I'm sure many of you have been there. It's busy 7 nights a week. 7 nights a week. And I look at Newton Center and I think of, what can be done in that in the parking lot there. And we've been talking about developing that for 20 years. And a lot of people in the neighborhood don't want anything to be done there. And it's just an opportunity that we're missing out on, especially with the transportation that we have there.
Thank you. Melanie, anything about what Lee told us today that resonated with you that you want to share?
Sure, lots.
Press it hard.
Hello. Yeah, lots resonated with me, but there were 2 things that stood out, and it's about history far looking back, and then history perhaps the last decade or so. Someone asked the question about what can we do. There's policy, there's planning, there's production, and what can we do on the ground as everyday people. I think in understanding history, some of that is to understand that what we have actually came by privilege. So what these communities are, if you think about a Wellesley, if you think about a Newton, acquiring these single-family homes and living in them for these generations and sending your children to these schools and then taking the resource that you have to send them to college and so on. All of that is about a generational path that whole demographics were systematically closed out from starting in the 1930s. So what I'm living on the ground, day to day, when I'm helping people think about not just where do I want to buy a house, it's more like where can I even afford to look, what can I afford to consider, has so much to do with whether or not they're going to take a job, as Chris mentioned, whether or not they're going to take a position that requires them to move across the country to this market, can they actually afford? So these are the questions to think about, and that the housing itself it's been so tight for more than a decade. That's influencing how tight it is. That's influencing how much resource it takes to even navigate these markets. So the big irony is that in order to even step into these markets, you need family wealth that comes from equity in housing that whole demographics just don't have. So there's a lot there that that's sitting with me as I think about these numbers. And one last thing is that I love the idea of a 15-minute community. I studied urban planning as an undergrad. I live in a community that is like that. Jamaica Plain is like that. That's where I live. But that's also where the money flows. That's where the generational wealth flows, is to those places that have all the things. So you need more and more places that have all the things so that you're not concentrating wealth in these pockets that are so exclusive.
Great, thank you. Andrew.
Sure, good morning. I guess the takeaway is what we've been doing is not working, right? I think and I think collectively we all need to sort of think about how we're going to produce housing going forward, because it has been, it just hasn't worked. Darrell mentioned Arsenal Yards, and there are several Watertown councilors and planning board members here. And that project happened over a 10-year period. We bought them all in 2013, and we are effectively done here in 2023. But it required a lot of discussion and engagement with the community, and I think I give Watertown, the planning board, a tremendous amount of credit. They understood, what it was we were trying to do. Oh, by the way, what we got approved in early 2017 does not look like what we have today, right? The planning board and the community gave us the flexibility to pivot as life science became a much more popular development choice for us and for the community. And so, we those discussions, I think, have to happen, and everything has to be a two-way street. But again, back to what Lee said, collectively, what we've been doing over the past, 30 or 50 years to produce very little housing regionally has not worked.
Great. All right, Andrew, I'm going to have you turn that one off, because I think that's the problem with the feedback, and share Melanie's. Anyway, so that brings us to, I think, Andrew, you brought us to the right place there, which is, Chris, if I'm not mistaken, your boss has been saying we have a shortage of 200,000 housing units across the region. The MBTA Communities Law won't solve all that, right? But it's part of it, and I'll come back to you and ask you that. But I want to start by asking both Andrew and Darrell, since they have the actual experience of building stuff, to try to understand let's assume that our communities go ahead and follow the law and do what they need to do. How soon do things get built? And I ask that knowing that we all know inflation is where it is. Interest rates are impossible, make it very difficult. There's a labor shortage. Even if everybody wanted to build tomorrow, there's not enough people to build tomorrow. And supply chain. So how quickly could we see progress, even if we move forward with the rezoning and all the things we need to do? And Darrell, and you want to start there?
Well, just yesterday, I'm associated with Redgate out of Boston. We do a lot of advisory work and also development. And we met with one of our lenders yesterday, and it wasn't a good meeting. They just changed the way that they are looking at things. And 18 months ago, they expected XYZ for return, and today they want almost like 15 to 20% less. More. And so it makes it really hard. So all the costs jumped up. We all know about cost overruns. Even with small projects. Those that live on the Cape or on the Vineyard or in Nantucket. Have any of you been through, let's bring it down to a single family, have you done any construction over the last 2 years? So just multiply that by 10 times what developers are going through. And then I'm doing a project in South Carolina. I'm building a house for my sister, and the contractor cannot keep staff or a team. Every 2 or 3 weeks, one or two guys quit. People just don't want to be in the trades anymore. So that's another issue that we're dealing with. But I think your question is when I think it's going to start getting built. The lenders yesterday were saying that they don't see anything changing in their business plan for another 18 months to be sure that things are changing. That was the number they gave us.
Andrew, what are you seeing on the actual construction possibilities?
Well, so let's just sort of talk about a timeline on a typical project. If we find a site in a community, let's say we find enough land to build and develop 200 units, it probably takes us 6 months to agree with the land seller on a price. It then is probably 18 to 24 months of permitting with the community. It's then somewhere around 9 months once we are entitled for us to draw the drawings, and then it's another 24 months for us to construct the building. So kind of adding that all up in my head, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 years for us to produce a mythical 200-unit project. And what has happened in the past, as Darrell talks about, things that were permitted 12 and 18 and 24 months ago are now unfinanceable. The ground has shifted. Maybe you agreed to things during the permitting process that you can't really afford to do now, or the land seller, you gave the land seller more money on a per unit basis than you can afford to do now. Interest rates have moved, and the return on cost threshold that the bank is expecting us to meet is now just not feasible. So I think you're starting to see, or you will start to see, things finish and then other things just not start. And that is probably first and foremost a capital markets problem. I think labor, as things start to slow down, I think labor locally will sort of solve itself. You hear those subcontractors telling you now that they're seeing out 6 and 12 months that they're not going to have work. So construction pricing will modulate a little bit. But right now, I think we have a capital markets problem.
So I think it's fair to say that those who are trying to spark fear in our communities that the city council passes this on a Tuesday or town meeting passes it on a Tuesday, that on Wednesday we're suddenly building everything, right? Not going to happen, just the practicality of it. But Chris, maybe you can talk about how the state views that. We know that this is an important step in MBTA communities, but it's going to take it's a long build here.
It is important to reduce the time as much as we can, and the as-of-right zoning that is part of the MBTA communities is an important piece of that. Obviously, the housing ecosystem has lots of other pieces to it, but we're trying to remove that barrier of the permitting. So as-of-right zoning, I didn't really address this in the slide presentation, is very different to get. You might have a site plan review process, but site plan review is legally very different from a special permit review. In a special permit process, the planning board or whatever board you're in front of can decide that the use does not fit. Multifamily just does not fit this area, which I think we've all heard lots. In a site plan review process, the use is not at question. Health and safety is at question. Are the driveways in the right location? Can the fire department get in and out? All that kind of stuff. So that is a really different permitting or entitlement process for the builders. I also want to say that in addition to the for-profit builders, nonprofit builders need an easier process as well, and those are the folks who build a lot of our affordable housing.
Thank you. And actually, Andrew, maybe I'm just going to go back to you for a second here. So it's a slow build. If things are rezoned in our village centers, it's going to take a long time. How might Newton Center look different, and how long might it take? If Newton Center could do what Newton Center wanted to do, or we envision Newton Center, when might we see change? Are we talking about?
That's sort of an unanswerable question.
Yeah, I know.
I think Newton Center looks different in 15 years. And there are a lot of stakeholders. There are a lot of different property owners. There are a lot of different businesses. I think, we saw success here in Newton with the Austin Street parking lot redevelopment. But I believe that took 8 years. 12 years. I'm sorry, it's a blur, right? It's all a blur. I've been here since 2022, so 21 years. And so if the city decided tomorrow that they wanted to do something with that parking lot, could we expect the same 12-year process? All things sort of being equal, I would say yes. Now, maybe there is a desire amongst the residents in Newton and City Hall and all of the other stakeholders to do something, and you could get together and collectively, but you're probably talking, 5 to 8 years, in a perfect scenario. And I think we could all agree that something has to happen with Newton Center. Newton Center needs to look different in some way, shape, or form. What that means is really the $64,000 question.
So, Chris, you mentioned the change, and we are grateful that the state did change the regulations so that we're allowed to take those single-story retail buildings that exist in Newton and in Needham and in Watertown and in Wellesley and add a second floor to it. What did you call it? Something with roofs? Retail with roofs. So adding a second story there. Help us understand why that's important and what that might mean.
Sure. Well, from my, back in the day when I was in the municipal government, I did both economic development, housing, and other land use. And so a phrase that I've learned is that retail loves rooftops, right? So the more rooftops that are around and proximate in this kind of mixed-use scenario, Newton Center, can have, build, housing above those single story. It'll add incentive for developers to kind of come in, whether they have to build on top or they have to start afresh. But you have that active pedestrian landscape that is often near a lot of our historic train stops and train stations, or even not, next to transit, but it's that active streetscape. And so allowing those areas to count or to offset towards this unit capacity that we've set was really important for many, many communities, and we heard loud and clear, and we're already starting to hear from the Newtons, the Brooklines, and the other communities that want to use it, the Franklins. It's not just, the Metro West or kind of, close in. It's some of these more historic communities that grew up with their downtowns are right around their commuter rail station. And so that activity is really important. They were worried about residential-only development coming in if they couldn't require that ground floor to be retail, and that might start to create some gaps in that kind of active retail space. I hope that helps, Greg.
Thank you. Melanie, as a person who shows people places to live and looks for people, what does it do if we change our villages and allow the buildings to be taller? Who does that help? Who are the customers that would want to live there?
Yeah, everything Chris was saying just made so much sense. I think the three things that people are searching for, whether they live here already or they have to relocate, is schools. That's not for everyone, but a lot of people are thinking about schools. They're thinking about public transport, and they're thinking about community amenities like parks and shops. And so the more of that you have in a central location, frankly, the higher the property values, the more demand. But it allows people to have the fullness of their lives in one place. And there's so much, you all are talking about distribution costs and all of those things that go into construction, but there's all these other factors that go into people who are looking to locate in a place or figure out what they can afford. A big part of that is also childcare. So if you can have an urban center, an urban core, or an urbanized core that has the walkability to train stops of things like not only the pharmacy and a small grocery store, but also childcare, that's huge. We have people who are competing fiercely using generational wealth to buy properties where in-laws can come and stay with them because they cannot afford childcare. Okay, and they can't afford to add the commute plus childcare and work. So all of these are in the matrix for people. So building close in, having everything in a way that's accessible for all kinds of family types is really significant.
Thank you. And I want to dig deeper into some of the numbers that Lee presented. The Boston Indicator study in the 1980s, 76% of the region's black population lived in Boston. But by 2020, so 20 years later, 2/3 of the region's black population lived outside of Boston proper, so about 64%. They moved to the suburbs, but they did not move to our suburbs. Wellesley, over 10 years, from 2010 to 2020, saw only a 0.5% increase in black population to 2.9% of Wellesley's total population. Needham saw only a 1.1% increase in black residents to 2.4 total in Needham. Newton saw just about the same, 1.2% to 4.2 of the total population of Newton, and black residents in Watertown grew by 1.3% over that decade to 4.9%. Why is it that our communities have not done what other communities have done, which is attract black residents? And Melanie, I'll start with you because we had a great conversation about this a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think that often we're trying to be careful and we're trying to be aspirational, so we have these conversations about equity or access or being welcoming in this kind of glazed over way. You know, we're talking about making sure things look more diverse. But what we're really talking about is power and access to resource, and understanding that systematically certain demographics have exclusively had access to resource and others systematically have not. And so if we can really think about it like that, then it is not an equal playing field, even if you have a black person who's a really sought after get for a local corporation or for a university, competing alongside a white person for that same position. More than likely, statistically, and in my experience in helping advise people who would be relocating to these areas, more than likely, the white family is going to have more resources to access, to leverage, to be able to even consider where they want for schools, what kind of commute is going to be workable for their lives, and can they actually afford housing, and can they get a house that actually accommodates all their family needs, including intergenerational needs. The generational wealth gap is just so real. It is so on the ground. It is so on the ground. So, you know, in Massachusetts, one of the numbers I didn't hear Lee talk about today is, I think the way the language is framed is that the average sort of family wealth of a white family is $200,000 in Massachusetts, and that of a black family is $8, right? So that's not incidental, it's severe, it's extreme. And so if someone is considering a position and they are black, they might be first generation in their family to be considering such a position. They might be first in their family, generation in their family even to have gone to college. I know this from my own experience. I'm a child of immigrants and working class immigrants. And so you come to a city like this, so awesome. People come here, they want to stay in the Boston region, but it takes a lot of money to stay in the Boston region. And so you might have needs that the white family might not have. You might actually have to take care of your elder parents who don't have means for their aging. They might have to come live with you. So there's all these needs that you have to accommodate, but you don't have the family wealth to resource, to land on. So you have to think about much farther out, and that means you might not have the choice of schools that you want. And so I see this all the time. I have universities reach out to me. They're doing this equity work. They are doing recruitment for really top gets from around the country. And those folks come here and they're like, this is nice, but this doesn't, there's no way I could compete in this market. There's no way. Or I help them understand, oh, given the resources you have, you can't compete in this market. We can only think about this market. And that's limiting, that's not attractive. So what that means is that we're also getting brain drain of really, really good talent, of people of color who could be coming here and staying. And then a lot of the people who are staying, who might be generationally rooted in communities like Boston, can't afford to move into these higher priced exclusive suburbs, frankly, and in a lot of ways can't even stay in the city of Boston. So that's where you heard Lee talking about folks moving to Brockton and Lynn. Those markets are fiercely competitive right now. Fiercely competitive. Framingham, all of it, because people can't afford to stay in the urban core. So now you're having like a reverse great migration, and that should be concerning to our communities.
All right. Daryl, I'm going to turn it to you in the same. So you're a Newton resident. You've raised a family here. I don't want to dismiss the wealth gap at all because it's really significant, but I get there's more to it than that, and why Newton isn't as diverse as it might be or these other communities. You want to?
Yes, that question challenges me.
Yeah.
Because I think that, our community here, Newton and Wellesley and Needham, and whether you're white or brown, it's hard to afford to live here. And I read something about 40% of Newton's kids under 25 are living at home with their parents. And it's because of the cost of living. And I think the other thing is that we got to just make sure that we're more welcoming to people. I got picked up by a black friend on Sunday to go to the Patriots game. And when I got in the truck, he said, "Wow, man, is there any color out here?" And he's a very successful guy, very successful guy. Lives in Canton. And then he shared a story with me of another black male and his family who was very successful, worked for a particular company, one of the top 5 people there. He lived in Newton, and he had problems here. And he moved away from Newton 2 years ago because he thought it was not welcoming. We still have that problem. So it's not just about the money, it's about people feeling welcome. The guy who left here 2 years ago could afford every one of your homes in his, he's has done that well. I've been here since 2003 is when I moved here. And in my neighborhood, and I think I shared this with you when you came over once, within 12 blocks of me, I only know of 2 other brown people. That's a problem. That's a problem. And it's not just my neighborhood, it's your neighborhoods too. And so we all have friends, and you say it's more than that. I look at, most of the brown people have left and went down to Brockton and Randolph and Stoughton and down that way. And the problem with that is they moved there thinking that they're going to have a better life because the cost of living is going to be there. What they did not take into account is the commute coming back to Boston. And more than 5 out of 10 within a year changed jobs for less money. And their lifestyle does not change, and now they're stuck.
And you know what, Daryl? It's also what I'm seeing is now that suburban stretch, it's all about transportation, is now going down to Rhode Island, Providence. People are going way beyond Brockton. They're going to Providence. They're going to New Hampshire. And that's brain drain.
Yeah.
And wealth drain.
Let's go back to the MBTA community laws as sort of applies in terms of affordability. Chris, you mentioned that affordability isn't a requirement for this rezoning, although there's a way to include it. Can you, or at least affordable housing isn't a requirement. Can you explain the thinking there and why not, and how we explain that to people who wonder?
The statute, which is actually in the slide presentation, but in something called an appendix, because I just, showing you guys the statute was, you're not going to read it. It is only 3 paragraphs. It does not talk about affordability. It does not mention affordability. So when developing the guidelines, we have to stay within, for those of you in town meeting, there's a box that you have to kind of stay within the bounds of the box. When you're writing guidelines to implement statutory language, you kind of have to stay within the bounds of the box. And so our first iteration of the guidelines did that, and then we heard from communities how important it was to have inclusionary zoning. And so within 2 months of issuing the first guidelines, we did make that revision back in 2022 to add the ability of communities to have, whether they had town or city-wide inclusionary zoning that was higher than 10%, or had they wanted to have, they had a range, like they have some at 10% of the units at 80%, and then they have some areas that might have 15% of the units at 60% of AMI, and they have maybe different advantages in zoning to do that kind of thing, different incentives. So we wanted to make sure that that they could do that, and that they could require some affordable housing, and so that's why we changed the regulations. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And actually, I'm going to take questions, open up the floor to comments in just a moment. But maybe, Andrew, you could just talk a little bit about, if we're talking about building up villages with small units or whatever, what does that do with pricing in the market in general? I understand it doesn't help those who need that truly affordable, but what does it do for the rest of the pricing in the market if we allow these small units in our village centers?
Well, it's just supply and demand. I think we have an imbalance, right? There is just not enough supply, and we have, and the communities we've been talking about today, Newton, Wellesley, Needham, Watertown, the demand is off the charts relative to the existing housing stock. So, we talk about affordable housing, and whether that's at 10 or 15 or 20%, we'll call that sort of big A affordable, but there's just general affordability. You look at the market rate rents, and now we're north of $3,000, I think, on average for a one-bedroom. That's just supply. And if we can, every additional unit is helping the demand side of the equation. And it's just, depending on the study, and maybe Chris can confirm or deny my number, but we need somewhere between 250 and 400,000 units in eastern Massachusetts. And, we're going to have to do it. Ideally, it'd be great to do it 300 and 400 and 500 units at a time, but in a lot of these communities, we're going to have to do it 2 and 4 and 6 units at a time.
But I do think, Melanie, you want to say something right now?
Yeah, I just want to speak to that a little bit on the ground, where I was talking about recent history. I think that, what we hear in the news about all the competition for housing, people purchasing 10, 20, 25, 40% above the listing price for property, that wasn't new as of the pandemic. That had been going on in a lot of these communities, most of these communities right around Boston, since 2012-ish. And a lot of that was coming out of the recession, where there had been such a drop-off in construction. Rent prices had gone up, and interest rates went down, historically low for the first time in so long. I mean, interest rates, I remember when they hit 4%, we were like, ugh, and they continued to go further down. That meant that people had more buying power than they had ever had in history, in their family's history, in their parents' history. People had buying power, but they had to use that because rents just kept going up, and rents have not stopped going up. So the housing crunch is actually extreme. Like, there's a long run to even catch up to where we should be. So all of this, when people hear 500, units of housing, like, we really are, there is that much of a dearth. And what's happening is people with resources are competing for the little things that are there. So that's why the house prices are so costly. It's because people will pay, I call it sever a limb, to get a house that's not even big enough, just to be close enough in. That's extreme. And so the more housing that's built, the less and less pressure there is on the existing stock from people who would want to be able to consider but can't.
Thank you. And Andrew, one last thing I wanted to ask you. So the MBTA would allow us to build 3-4 unit housing units, or maybe slightly bigger, by right, but does not change the rules for the big developments, the Nines, the Kendricks, the Trios, Boulevard and Bonds that we've seen. Tell us why we still need to make sure we're approving and moving those forward. I can certainly imagine the community pushback saying, well, we're allowing all this other rezoning, we've made these changes, we don't need those big projects anymore.
Well, I think we're just back to the number. If you need, let's say the low end, you need 250,000 units. To do it 4 units at a time is going to be well beyond all of our probably collective lifetimes, right? So you have to have, and it's a mix of housing. You have to have those infill, sort of small, walkable city sort of kinds of units that'll happen around these village centers. And then we need to find opportunities to put bigger, more multifamily. Look at Watertown. Look at the Arsenal Street corridor. There are 3 very significant multifamily developments there that have added just about 900 units in really what is probably the last 10 years. those sites were available. The one was an old brick and block plant. We had Arsenal Yards where we had all of the empty parking lots, and then a site that Gables and Hanover did sort of halfway in between. So it's a combination. It's just math, and unfortunately, the number is quite large, and is going to take a very long time. But it's necessary.
Okay, everybody, it's your turn. Who has a question, comment? You could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Ann Mara Lanza, and I'm from Wellesley. And first of all, just thank you, Chris, for all that you've done for housing in your time. It's great, and we've been looking a lot at the work that's coming out of the state. My concern is that at least in our community, I've been told by a couple of developers that the MBTA zoning that we're going to accomplish isn't going to actually produce any housing because of just the economics of what's going on in our community. And I've also been told that we have some municipal property that for some reason can't be part of this, and that's a place where we actually have the ability as a community to maybe create the housing. So we have a couple parking lots. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that in municipal land and how that fits in here.
Hi, Ann Mara. Nice to see you. So in the weeds in the rules, publicly owned property is defined as excluded land, and the reason for that is that it's often a sewage treatment plant, a school, another use that will go on for a long time. We do understand that municipal properties do turn over, and actually is one of the best practices to develop housing, in particular affordable housing. There may be other efforts, and it may not fit in MBTA communities zoning. If you can override the exclusion of that property if it's in your district by letting us know we have disposed of this property. We're about to do an RFP for a developer, but you have to be a certain way forward for us to kind of acknowledge that. And so we do allow that, but in only very special circumstances. So I would encourage you, if you want to move forward and you have another year, get that on town meeting for disposal or creating it as surplus, and then start an RFP process. That is the kind of thing that we could count. We can't necessarily count it if there's been absolutely no work and maybe someday we will do this. And so we're trying to be pretty specific. I would encourage you to go forward. It doesn't have to be part of the MBTA Communities District, just keep going forward. And we have funding available for feasibility studies, for example, for municipal areas. I did want to just touch on the number. I'm not going to confirm or deny any particular housing gap. Our agency is going to embark on a study ourselves to try and identify this missing gap of housing units. Some people say 200,000. The unit capacity of all the 177 MBTA communities is about 285,000. We know not all of that will get built, and not all districts will produce all of the housing that they're proving with the unit capacity. But anyway, so I can't confirm any particular number. I know there are lots of different numbers out there, but we're going to be studying it and coming up with our number. And one other point I want to make is that, of course, production is only one piece of the housing puzzle. There's also public housing. There's very low and providing housing for very low and moderate income. There's emergency assistance for our homeless families and the migrants that are coming in. So all of these are all part of the housing puzzle. Production's super important, I think. But I do want to acknowledge that it is complicated and there are other factors.
Jean McKnight, Needham Planning Board, and it was in one of these forums, either last year or the year before, after the forum was over and we're in a circle talking, and I was talking with some developers, and my question was, and this goes to what Lee Pelton said about family wealth. What we need are condominium units. Both for young families to have a lower entry point to ownership, and for seniors, I speak from personal experience, downsizing, wanting to stay in their community and be able to move, to have the security of ownership. What the developer said in this little circle was, you cannot get the financing for condominium development. The lenders perceive it as more risky. Now, I didn't really understand that fully, but I wonder, with both of the gentlemen, everybody I think on the panel talked about financing and the difficulty of it. Could you address getting funding for condominium development as compared with rental?
Right now, it's tough to get finance for anything, whether it's a condo, an apartment, or apartment building. I think we do need the condos, though, and I think we also need the apartments. It's easier for someone to purchase a condo than it is a single family, especially out our way in the Nunes, the Watertowns. And so, but during good times, you can get financing for both. And that time is going to come again. I think the problem that we were having here was that our residents were fighting all development, whether it was apartments or condos. And I think the shift is changing now, and hopefully that when the economy gets better again, which hopefully will be the next 18 months, would you agree with that? Hopefully. There was a nice article in the Globe today talking about how I have my senior moments. One of them. But the Globe was just saying that things are much, much better, and that the Federal Reserve is holding back just to make sure that the trend is going to stay on the road that it is now, but it's almost to where they want it to be at 2%, and it's at 3.1%.
Yeah, I think you were referring to Larry Edelman's story that said inflation is toast.
Yes, that's right.
Lynn Sweet, you want to add something to this?
Oh, hi, Lynn Sweet, LDS Consulting Group. I just wanted to quickly answer the question about the condominiums. It is actually the banks. They are regulated, and they can only lend on 3% of their balance sheet for condominiums and other high-risk investments. So I think it's not that they don't want to lend, it's that there are regulations that are preventing them from doing that. So in order for a developer to develop a condominium, they're going to have to put in a significant amount of equity, and they're also going to have to sell out a significant number of units before they hit the ground. I think we can all agree that we want to definitely see more condos, but the economics today are really tough.
Hi, Elizabeth Tibbetts-Nutt from 128 Business Council. This question is mostly for Chris. I know, there's no real mechanism in our state for statewide and regional planning, and that was actually one of the many reasons I was really excited about this law. And I'm kind of wondering I know there are a lot of folks, we work with a lot of communities that are very freaked out about the details of getting this one enacted, but I'm kind of wondering if there's already talk about what you're imagining next. Is there a possibility for this to be sort of a gateway law towards a little bit more aggressive lawmaking around zoning in general? Because, for example, ground level commercial doesn't get us to a 15-minute city. And many, many of the zoning regulations that prevent the creation of 15-minute cities are controlled currently at a municipal level, right? So no matter what our sort of state goals are around improving lifestyle and decreasing transit times and all of that, there's not a lot of ability to do that without creating the kinds of laws like this one that haven't existed before. So I guess I'm asking if you in your office are already thinking about what might be next.
Thank you very much. It's a great question. I'm going to say please stay tuned. One of the big challenges, so my boss, the Secretary Edward Augustus, who is the first housing secretary in 20 years, I think, one of his big assignments is to produce a housing bond bill. The housing bond bill is obviously a financing tool. The housing bond bill can also have policy sections. For example, this law and the law that changed to simple majority was part of the economic development bond bill, which was in 2020. 2020 passed right at the end of the session, right at the very end of 2020, and signed in January of 2021. So please stay tuned to the announcement of the housing bond bill and its policy sections. So that will be this fall. Don't have a specific date for you, but stay tuned for that announcement, and then tune in and see what that's where we're going to see what we're thinking about.
Janet Pocaro, Keller Williams Realty. I noticed the bottom line is that we all want more condos. I wonder if you have thought about ways to incentivize the developers to build those condos rather than the massive amount of rental units, high-end rental units. So this is not helping people buy in. These are expensive units.
Is that a question for me as the state? Is that? Well, that's a really good comment. So again, one of the things about the MBTA Communities Law that I'd like to remind people is that nonprofits and people who build housing on the naturally occurring affordable housing and the capital A affordable housing, they need land too, and they need an easier entitlement process. So in some ways, I hope that this law, through 177 communities and hundreds and thousands of acres of districts that will be by right multifamily, will be an incentive, will be not necessarily an incentive, but will pave the way for easier development. We do look at, in our housing development funding, there's something called a qualified action plan. I don't want to, there's a lot of housing stuff that I could get into. That is where we set out our goals and our priorities for who we're going to give funding for new affordable housing projects. And so compliance with MBTA communities, it would not surprise me if that showed up. We have other capital, I do a lot of regulating. The other part of my job is I have about $50 million in capital money a year to give out, and we absolutely prioritize that funding, which is for planning, for infrastructure, for communities who are doing the right thing, for communities who are in compliance with MBTA communities. We also have all of your communities are something called housing choice communities. That was a program that was started with a grant program. We used to give out $250,000 at most. It's now $300,000 in this grant round, and so we have more money for that. That is money to help communities and encourage them to continue building housing. But I would say that at the big picture, for real housing development funding, which is I don't know, over $50 million, I think it's about $80 million a year, that is in that qualified action plan, which is where we set our priorities. So look there for any other changes.
Thank you. We're going to take one more question, and then I want to ask the panel to think if there's one more thing you want to tell us that you haven't had a chance to talk about. Think about that panel, and we're going to go to Hillary Brown, chair of our real estate committee.
Hi, I'm Hillary Brown. I'm with Fairlane Properties and Live in Newton Center. And I want to follow up on something that Darrell said. I know this is tangential to our main point today, but you go to New York, you go to Washington and Atlanta and Chicago, and there is a substantive professional class of people of color. And you said that this issue for people of color is more than money, which we all know that it is. So it's tragic to hear that your friend had to move. And
A friend's friend.
Your friend's friend. And we have a lot of people of color who graduate from our wonderful schools and our graduate schools here, and they don't feel comfortable staying. So how do we start making people of color comfortable here? I mean, you can't change people, but you have to change people. But where do we start?
Yeah, what a loaded question. I don't know if you agree, but I think that what has happened politically during the last 4 or 5 years has really made that even more difficult. And so I think, I know myself, for myself, I don't think you guys know how brown people are feeling today. I just did a road trip with 5 guys for 10 days. And I flew into DC, went from there and went to Virginia Beach. We drove to Virginia Beach for 2 nights. And it wasn't really happening because it was the week of, kids going back to school. just the racism that we saw, it was incredible, like professional guys. And then we left there and went to Raleigh, North Carolina, and that community was great. Enjoyed it, had a wonderful time, and as you know, you said earlier, a lot of people moving to North Carolina and South Carolina. We left there and went to Myrtle Beach, and we were out having dinner at a restaurant, and then one of the guys pointed to the roof deck of the bar next to us, and it said, "Make America Great Again, go home." This is a Myrtle Beach on the beach. On the beach. And, kids, black kids now, we all have the conversation with them about if the cop pulls you over, don't move your hands. How do you get your driver's license out if you can't move your hand? We're going through so much now, and I think that, we live out here and we're fortunate we don't see it. And I told my friends who live down south, I feel fortunate that I live in Boston because we're a lot more liberal and less of that is happening. But throughout the country, it is a freaking problem. So I don't know how you fix that because we're scared that, what the last president has done to us has moved us back 25 plus years. And that's not going to come back in 5 years. And money can solve some of those problems and eliminate some of those issues, but most people don't have money. And so they're stuck.
Daryl, thank you for that. And I just want to, there's one other thing I think we should ask you about that's related, which is the Boston Real Estate Inclusion Fund that you began and the idea there and what that's supposed to do in terms of...
Sure, it's called BRIEF, Boston Real Estate Inclusion Fund. And first, I want to thank you and the state for doing the Massport model, and most of you are familiar with the Massport model. It requires that any land any development on public land needs to have inclusion in every area of it, at every part of the development process. That's in terms of vendors, the investment dollars, and so every developer was going out trying to find minority partners to be part of their teams. And that was challenging in the beginning, but now it's working out because there are a lot more new developers that are coming up. But the hardest part for the majority of developers was to find the money because they needed money in the development process. And so there's a limited number of black and brown people in Boston that have money to invest in multiple deals. And so most of the majority developers don't know who those individuals are. And so myself, Kurt Seitz, and Richard Taylor came up with this idea of if we worked together and did a fund, we could raise the money. And we're part of a group called the Real Estate Executive Council, which is all the top black and brown real estate developers across the country. And so we knew that we could, we went to the city and to the state first to make them understand that there's a limited pool of money from black and brown people and that we need to bring money in from out of state. And there are a lot more people out of state that have monies to do that. And so we partnered with Kurt Seitz's wife, Tammy Jones, who has $2 billion of funds that she can, put in any deal that she wants to. She has, direct power over that. So she preloads our deals and then we backfill them. But the other thing is that with our side of the coin is that we only need 51% of the money to come from black and brown people and women, all women. And then 49% can come from anywhere else. So when we first floated this idea and went around and talked to the developers, everyone that we chatted with says, I want to invest in the fund. Because true, you might not believe it, but most developers want to be in great deals. And we're all competing against the same deal. So when somebody gets it and they know it's a great deal, if they get an opportunity, they're going to invest in it. And so we've been very fortunate. We have 4 deals that we've done, and people just love the idea that they can invest this money. And it's an open fund so that you get to choose the deal that you want to invest in. It's not a closed fund, so you're not giving the fund your money and they go invest it where they want to. We float every deal out and you decide if that's the deal that you want to be a part of. But it's been a true blessing from the state and that and now black and brown people and women are able to invest in a lot of great deals.
Thank you. Melanie, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to Hillary's question and what Daryl said, if you choose.
Geez, Hillary, I can't quite remember. It was so big.
Row of professional class in Boston of people of color.
I share that vision. I share that desire. I knew the cities that you were going to run down. You know, Atlanta, Chicago. These are cities that I envy. Even though I do love being in New England, I love this region. I honestly don't know, and I'm somebody who has an answer for anything. I really don't know. I think it is important, though, for us to understand that we're part nationally and regionally, part of a major demographic shift. There are a number of shifts going on, and that's what Lee was talking about. It's like, you know, there's this out-migration. There's so much changing because housing is so expensive. But if you even think about the communities right now that black people primarily live in, those were communities that Jewish people lived in before they did their out-migration. So can we look at this moment and understand it in a historical context? And can we then, in doing that, try to think about what doesn't exist yet, like Chris was talking about, and try to imagine what begin to live life like the community that you actually want to see, but you have to have honest conversations with yourselves about what's missing and why. I wish I knew. I mean, I think there's so much, arts is, all those communities that you're mentioning, I'm like, well, they have vibrant arts. They have, you know, there's so much that could be added, and all these different sectors that can contribute to that, not just housing. So, but I think part of it is looking at yourselves and looking at the wealth concentration and understanding that it's not incidental. And okay, how do we disrupt that? And so having a disruptive mindset and thinking about demographics and history.
Thank you both. Go ahead.
Also say, we all know that there has been a huge shift in terms of leadership in the city of Boston and some in the suburbs with a lot of the corporations. I think that we have more senior black and brown people that have gotten these positions over the last 5 years than we've had in the last 25 years. But then, let's not forget that there was a letter that was published of an email that went out that says, let's take our city back. And so I'm not going to call any names, but you know, when you have another person, you know, who's supposed to be part of the city to send out a letter like that, it's sort of like it puts you on alert. It puts you on alert. And I think that Boston is, you know, people who don't live here are somewhat jealous of us because they don't really see the whole story. But we live here. We see the whole story. We know the real truth. And so I think that, you know, the fact that we have black and brown people in leadership position now is the way that the city is supposed to be, the way the state is supposed to be. And so, you know, you can't, I forgot one of the quotes earlier today, but you really can't change things if you keep them the way that they are all the time. And so I know, you know, Mayor Wu made some changes, Marty Walsh made some changes, and people were really concerned about those. But now it's like we're moving in the right direction. We're moving in the right direction.
Can I say one more thing? So I have one more thought. It's not an answer to you, Hillary, but it's a thing that's been swirling in my mind, and it's why Greg and I spoke to begin with initially, which is that I am comfortable talking very directly about the thing. You know, the problem, naming it, identifying it. And I'm not that vested in making people comfortable as we try to undo the problem. And so I'm watching, again, like it could be Harvard School of Public Health, BU Law, whoever, reaching out and saying, can you give a tour to this person who's remarkable, and we so want them, and help them understand what the landscape is for schools, housing, whatnot, where they can settle. And I have these very honest, intimate conversations with folks and help them think about how do they leverage the cash they have. I'm not talking about how much money you can afford monthly or how much cash. It's like, do you have can you buy a house in cash? Can you buy a house in cash to compete with the next person? Because in the meantime, while we're waiting for new construction, you do have to compete for what exists. And what wins is how much cash, how much risk can you take on. And so for folks who, they are first generation in their family getting these opportunities, they're really sought after, it's remarkable to be in that position, but then to know that you can't actually, you're getting a certain compensation offer from this institution, but that doesn't even allow you to compete in this market. So I'm like, okay, well, if you really want to undo history and you want to allow access to people who usually wouldn't have these kind of positions at this university, give them compensation that allows them to actually compete in the market. I'm not talking about just a low interest loan. I'm talking about money to compete. I'm talking about cash, because they don't have that generational cash, right? So I don't know if you all are hearing what I'm saying, but I'm like, can corporations, can institutions really, if you're thinking from an equity lens, say we're gonna throw money at this? Because that would change things. That would allow more and more people access to compete in these very exclusive insular markets, frankly. That's what I see on the ground. And so it's not a very comfortable proposal, but it's something interesting. Compensation is important, and I know it because I'm hearing it from people. I'm hearing it directly.
Thank you, Melanie. Anybody want to add any? I think we don't have time for that. Anybody else on the panel want to add anything before Chris?
Thank you guys for that amazing conversation. I don't want to be too depressing here, but we have neo-Nazis that are marching in front of hotels. So it is really important to be aware of what is happening and be a participant and let people know what is okay and what is not okay in your community. And I just didn't want this conversation to go on when the Globe yesterday had an article about neo-Nazis marching in Quincy.
Thank you all for sharing. You're welcome to continue this conversation, but we're going to stop there. I'm grateful to all of you for being here, to our sponsors, to our panel, and to Lee Pelton. Thank you very much. We've got a lot of work to do.